Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillahi. Today we wanted to continue the discussion on Muslim, non-Muslim relations. And we wanted to get into the topic of the problem of when religion is used as a justification for the destruction of life. One of the things that we need to have an understanding of is that religion can be used to build community and civilization and society, or it could become an obstacle. The issue isn't religion in and of itself, but the issue is the understanding that the people may have of religion. So the problem comes back to how it is that people are thinking. The core of religious teaching, especially when we talk about Islam, is to be found in the objective of what we call the Sharia, or the maqsid of the Deen, the objective of the Sharia, the aim of Islam, in which life is held to be sacred and life is held to be that which the religion aims at preserving. When we look at Islam and its relationship to other religions, Islam acknowledged the truth in other religions and opened up the door to a discussion of where it is that there's differences. But it didn't leave the issue at that. Islam called to, and we see this in the prophetic example, to the reality of some sort of coexistence. And so when we look at the prophetic example in Medina, the constitution of Medina was essentially a pluralistic constitution. It was a political agreement between the peoples of Medina to live together and to build that society up. That was the initial orientation that was there in Medina. But when we look at the reality of the Quran doesn't come to negate the prophets of other communities. As a matter of fact, what it does is it upholds those prophets, especially when we talk about the quote unquote Abrahamic faiths. Islam acknowledges the prophets, Islam upholds them. But where there are differences between Islam and other religious orientations, Islam clarifies that, and Islam calls us to come to a common ground. We not only see that in the Quranic text, but we saw that in the example of the Prophet Muhammad's disciples, and we mentioned that before some time ago. We talked about the example of Ja'far bin Abi Talib when he went to Habasha, how he actually engaged the religious community there by calling to a common ground. That's extremely important to understand. So the first thing, before we move on in this discussion, is that we have to have an understanding that Islam looks at the goodness that is there in other religions, and where there's a point of difference, it clarifies that. And we have been talking about the issue of compulsion in religion, how Islam does not acknowledge compulsion in religion to be a legitimate means by which a person comes into the circle of Islamic brotherhood. People have to come into the brotherhood of worship freely. And we mentioned also before that there's such a thing as the Brotherhood of Humanity, because we come from the same origin. And this is not a politically correct concept. This is a concept in which we find in the Quran itself that Allah wa ta'ala is the creator of humanity. So it's impossible to deny that the origin of human beings is one, and that human beings in the Quranic understanding are the children of Adam, and that the children of Adam have been created in dignity and honor. لَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي Adam, as we have mentioned before. And so when it comes to inter-religious dialogue, the Islamic approach is to see where there's common ground and to acknowledge that common ground, and then to engage in an understanding of where there's differences, and to do that in the best of manners. And we mentioned that before. It's فَبِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. To approach that discussion where there's differences in the best of manners. So when we move into the issue of relations between Muslims and non-Muslims, it should be a relationship in which the brotherhood of humanity is acknowledged. First of all, we're dealing with human beings, and human beings have inherent dignity. And then second of all, we should see where there's common ground, especially when we are talking about the people of the book. But when we look at the reality of the brotherhood of humanity, we have an ayah of the Quran in which it translates, if your Rabb had so willed, he could have surely made humankind into one nation following one religion by default. Yet they will not cease to disagree except one onto whom the Creator, the Sustainer, has bestowed his mercy. And so here the idea is that the ability to come together is a manifestation of the mercy of God, right? It's a manifestation of the mercy of God. Illa man rahima rabbuk, right? And that's the idea that those who Allah has bestowed mercy upon and they have acknowledged that mercy, they're the ones that understand how it is that we should be dealing with these differences. And if they don't acknowledge that mercy that comes from God, then they will stay in the mode وَلَا يَزَالُونَ مُخْتَلِفِينَ, that they will remain people that are differing amongst themselves, right? They will remain people that are differing amongst themselves. So the diversity that is there amongst human beings is a diversity at the level of humanity, but human beings are of the same origin, so that diversity comes in language and in skin color and so on and so forth, and experience. And then there's the diversity of what people may believe. But Islam calls to the common ground. It calls for us to acknowledge what is good, what is right, what is truthful. And it calls us to take on the best of character and the best of orientation when it comes to dealing with those matters in which there's differences. And like we said before, la ikraha fi deen, that there's no compulsion in deen, is a matter of principle. So then humanity falls back on that Islamic teaching that when it comes to the Muslims dealing with others, we don't believe in forcing others to come into religious belief. People have to come of their own volition, their own freedom, and they have to acknowledge. Okay, so then that leaves us to the point that we mentioned where when people differ with one another in matters of belief and religion, then the issue comes back to differing with one another in the best of matters. That is what is the obligation of the Muslims. We have a prophetic teaching in which one of the companions, one of the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad was commissioned to go to Yemen. And he stated in a letter, which was part of the constitution for the people of Yemen, whoever dislikes Islam from those who are the followers of Moses or the followers of Jesus, the Jews and the Christians, he shall not be asked to change his religion, right? And so because the reality of the situation is that there's no compulsion of religion. We can share with others our understanding, but to force people to come into our religious belief is something that's rejected. And so then we come to a point, okay, so then where do we stand? When we live in a society where there's different religious orientations, we have to become acquainted with each other, because there's the issue of being co-workers, there's the issues of being neighbors, sometimes there's inter-religious marriages. And then there's the idea that we're in the same society. And so we have to integrate into that society to be able to continue life, right? And so we have to respect people's humanity, we have to respect people's dignity, we have to respect people's freedom, and we have to acknowledge where it is that there's mutual ground or there's shared understanding or there's shared values. And we'll deal with the issue of shared values in another session. the Quran affirms that the relationship among people who are different should be a relationship of acquaintance based on peace, cooperation, and integration, right? Only those who are the sources of corruption and oppression become the problem for society. But those who have different beliefs and so on and so forth, as long as they don't corrupt in the society, they're entitled to that. And so when we look, at the issue of religious fighting or religions attempting to destroy each other, that's not acknowledged in Islam. The issue is, though, oppression becomes the problem, but the fight against a person because that person has a different belief, that's not a practice is acknowledged in Islam. It's only when there is aggression towards society or towards humanity that Islam allows for there to be a defense. And so when we have that principle very clear, then we have this understanding that we are in society together with other religions, and we're called to be a mutual benefit. We're called to be a mutual benefit. And when we're called to be a mutual benefit, that means that we have to see how it is that we can cooperate with one another. And we have that principle even amongst Muslims themselves. تعاونوا على البر والتقوى ولا تعاونوا على الإثم والعدوان. Cooperate with one another in the highest standards of belief and in goodness overall, and in the details of religion. That applies both to the Muslim and to the non-Muslim, right? In our dealings with people. Of course, when it comes to dealing with the non-Muslims, we're not going to be able to cooperate with them in the details of religious practice because they don't believe in that. But we can cooperate with them in the issue of birr, in the issue of goodness overall. That's the rule of the Muslim, that how we live out community is that we are supposed to be in agreement to cooperate with each other in upholding the values that specifically we believe in because of religious belief and the tie into the religious community that we belong to, and the values that we believe in that are general, that apply to humanity as a whole. And that is believing in the Brotherhood of Humanity, that is the rights of neighbors, that is the cooperation to build society, and the agreement to ensure that society is not destroyed, and the agreement not to oppress each other, and so on and so forth, right? And so then that brings us to the prohibition that we have. وَلَا تَعَوَّنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. Don't cooperate with one another in that which is a violation of those values of religion, right? And don't cooperate with one another in animosity, in oppression, in that which is destructive towards human relationships, and so on and so forth. And so Islam calls towards acknowledging where it is that there's common ground and being clear on where there's differences, but having an understanding that there's some differences that are just going to exist, and then there's other things that are not tolerable, such as the destruction of life or the destruction of society, right? And we find that the Quran acknowledges goodness, right? And the Quran says they are not all the same. Among the people of the scriptures, a community standing in obedience, reciting the verses of Allah during periods of the night and prostrating in prayer. They believe in Allah and God and the last day, and they enjoy what is right and forbid what is wrong, and they rush to good deeds, and those are amongst the righteous. The Quran is acknowledging that there's a concept of people that are righteous in the communities that follow Moses and in the communities that follow Jesus. وَأُولَٰئِكَ مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ, the Quran says, right? And describes them as يُسَرِّعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ, that they rush, right? That they rush and they're quick to do good. And that أُولَٰئِكَ مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ, and those are from the people that do good. Those are from the people of do good, that do good. And so at the end of the day, what we see is that we have to have an understanding that the types of societies that we live in today's time are being struck by a lot of challenges, economic challenges, political challenges. And we acknowledge that these environments turn into environments in which racism and anti-religious behavior and bigotry and all of that comes about. So as Muslims, we have to be the people that call towards that common ground. That doesn't mean that we're going to eliminate all differences. That doesn't mean that that we agree on everything, that other religions teach, but we have to be just and fair. We have to be just and fair. And what that means is that we acknowledge where the common ground is, and we uphold what is right and just, and we think about what is in the benefit of the greater community, as well as what is within our interest. We just don't think about ourselves to the destruction of others, but we acknowledge that which upholds human dignity, and we acknowledge that which upholds freedom, and we acknowledge that which protects the goodness of society, to have a sense of balance. And so when it comes to some of the anti-religious sentiments that we see that people have amongst religious communities that lead to the destruction of life, we can't justify that Islamically, whether that comes from a Muslim or whether it comes from a non-Muslim, because in principle, the right to take life is not within the hand of anyone without the proper justification. And there's no justification to take life just on the basis of someone differing with you because of belief. And there's no justification to take life in the name of you're better than that person, right? And matter of fact, what Islam does is cause us to acknowledge the rights of others. It calls us to acknowledge the rights of others. And so at the end of the day, when we talk about the preservation of life, the preservation of life is established when we deal with all people with kindness and justice. And we have to acknowledge that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is described in the Quran as وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, that we have not sent you, O Muhammad, except as a manifestation of our compassion, right, for all of the creation, human beings, the material world that includes nature, that includes the animals, and that includes the natural environment, and the beings that are unseen. We acknowledge that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, came to teach us how it is that we begin to recapture a sense of regard for humanity, a sense of regard for humanity. So if the Prophet was sent as a mercy for humanity, it's impossible for us to have a religious discourse that's going to justify forcing people into religious belief and disregarding their humanity that clashes with the idea of compassion and mercy, or killing people or taking their life, or justifying hatred towards people just because we differ with them. Now, when it comes to certain actions that people may engage in that are destructive, then our conversation is, and we may hate those actions, our conversation then is singled out and limited to discuss that action. But it's not to hate the person because the person is this identity or that identity. Is to differ with that particular action, because we do have a moral code that defines what we consider to be right or wrong based on general principles of the Quran. So there's certain things, certain actions that we may differ with people, but it doesn't mean that we hate the person, because after all, we acknowledge that the person has dignity that has been bestowed upon that person by the Creator. لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, that the children of Adam have been honored. So there's no room to utilize religion to go against the very creation of God. That's not the point. The point when we're going to talk about clarifying what's right and wrong is not to attack people, or is not to denigrate people or go against people, is to deal with the action. To deal with the action of the person. And that action, we deal with it because it may be destructive to self or may be destructive to family or community or society. So then that becomes the point of dialogue. What is in the best interest of society? So the role of religion, as far as Islam is concerned in this regard, is to highlight that if we're going to be societies that are pluralistic, if we're going to be societies which deal with the human condition, if we're going to be societies which are fair and kind towards its citizens, then we have to begin to acknowledge that there's certain key things that have to be at the fore in how we talk about religion and the way religion influences people and the way they think about others. And that is that we have to highlight the shared humanity that we have, and that human beings have inherent dignity. And we have to talk about the common ground that's there between people of belief. That doesn't mean that we are going to agree on everything, but we're going to start from where there's a common ground. And then we have to acknowledge that people are free. They can't be forced into believing what we believe. And we have to acknowledge that after all is said and done, religion must uphold life, right? Hifdul nafs. And so we cannot utilize religion to justify the taking of life, whether it's within our religious community or whether it is in dealing with other religious communities, right? And there's a lot to be said in that regard, but we just wanted to lay out a basic framework in this regard. So we have some objectives of the Sharia, or objectives of Deen. And what we mean by that is that we've come to conclude that there's so many evidences of the Quran and the Sunnah, the prophetic example, that support certain key values. And these key values become fundamental. They become core teachings. They're objectives, meaning that if they're violated, then there's a problem with that understanding that a person may have that violate those core teachings, those objectives of Islam. And of those objectives of Islam, we find is the belief in human dignity, the belief that people should not be forced into coming into religious belief, the belief in justice, the belief in safeguarding human life, right? And the belief of doing good and repelling harm. Those are all things that are all objectives of the Deen, or objectives of Islam. And so when we bring those objectives together, we find at the end of the day that what Islam is calling us to is reminding us that we have to respect each other at the basic level when it comes to the fact that we're dealing with different religions. That doesn't mean we have to agree with every detail that other religions have, because then that will be a violation of what it is that we believe. But our religion calls us to have a common ground, right? El-kalimatu siwa, right, is envisioned in the Quran, to a common word, an equal word, a shared ground, a mutual point, which we can start to engage from. And so when we say that we acknowledge other prophets, we are already acknowledging that there's a shared common ground, especially between us and the followers of Moses and the followers of Jesus. We're saying we believe in God. We believe in the common origin of humanity. We believe in the concept of doing good. We believe in the concept of punishment and reward. We believe in the hereafter. We believe in accountability, and so on and so forth. We believe in human dignity. So those are all shared points that we have amongst each other. And based on that, we say that it's a problem when we see that religions are used to incite hatred or to justify the killing of others based on the issue of them being different than you, of them being different than you. We're called to deal with all people with kindness and justice, regardless of who they are. And with that, we end. Assalamu alaikum.